So I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors, Kathleen Mullen and David Powell, who are both here today, and they have promised me that they'll take the hard questions. And we'd also, of course, like to acknowledge funding from the Sloan Foundation. So we're going to talk about labor demand. And this is something we've really just been getting into as we try to push forward in connecting a long literature really on labor demand and local labor markets to the study of older workers and their labor supply behavior. This topic actually has been very widely studied, and in fact I'll kind of take you back in a way in that the approach we're going to use is an old one. But if you go back and look at that literature, older workers are often just simply omitted from the analysis altogether. And even though we might think that older workers could be especially responsive to labor demand conditions. That's really an open question, but there certainly are many reasons to believe why that could be the case. So just to preview our findings, we do find that older individuals are responsive to local demand conditions on many dimensions. So we're going to look at just employment rates, we're going to look at retirement transitions, re-entry transitions, and even Social Security claiming. They're especially responsive to labor demand shifts in the services industries. Okay? And that's going to be kind of the big story, I think, of this paper and what we're trying to sort out right now. What does that really mean? And we also show that these labor demand shifts are associated with wage increases and, interestingly, with improvements in non-pecuniary job characteristics, right? So the wage is not just the only lever that an employer has at its disposal to try and attract an older worker into the labor force or to retain that worker. So this is just another way of portraying information we saw yesterday, where we're looking at the employment employment growth by age group. So we're starting in 1980, and we normalize everybody's employment rate to 100. And then go forward 3 decades to 2010 and look at the growth in employment by age. And so this is essentially the great turnaround in employment among older workers, here shown by the kind of the dark orange and the yellowish orange line. So the warm colors are the older workers, and the cool colors are the younger workers. And this is very clearly, you see between 1990 and 2010, we see a very dramatic increase, about 40% increase in employment in the oldest age group, the 65 to 74-year-olds. And another increase in employment among the 55 to 64-year-olds, about 10% over those last 2 decades. And actually, in contrast, among the younger workers, the employment rates are actually declining relative to their levels in 1990. This 40% increase among the older group, 65 to 74, is actually 3/4 of that is driven by growth in service industry employment. And so this just shows the employment growth. And you can see, looking at, again, that dark orange line for the older workers, 65 to 74, the employment growth increase is about 30%, so 30 out of that 40. So about 3/4 of that growth is attributable to an increase in service industry employment. Looking at non-service industries, there's your other 10%. We still see an increase in employment by older workers of about 10%, 10 percentage points, and declines for the other age groups. So of course, this is not labor demand, this is just employment. Employment rates are equilibrium outcomes, and they reflect changes in labor demand, changes in labor supply. So how can we isolate changes in labor demand? Well, we're going to use the Bartik instrument, as it's often called. It's been widely used in a number of papers over a couple of decades to try to isolate changes in labor demand apart from other changes in employment that perhaps are related to aspects particular to local areas or driven even by labor supply. Okay. So the Bartik instrument will be it's the predicted employment growth rate in a local area. And that's derived from the interaction of national growth, the national growth rate, in an industry interacted with the local industry composition. Okay, so the employment shares in the industry in a local area, which vary across areas. So thinking about an area that, think of an industry that sees a 10% growth rate over a decade, an area that has a higher employment share at the beginning of that decade is going to see more jobs in that industry than an area that's got a much smaller concentration of that industry. So that's the basic idea here. So we use this predicted growth based on these aggregate national level shocks, if you will, and construct a predicted growth rate for each either MSA in the first part of our analysis or commuting zones in the second part of the analysis. Okay. The data we're going to bring to bear come from two sources, two primary sources. We're going to use the census and look at changes between 1980 and 90 to 2000, and then from 2000 to 2010 by pooling the American Community Survey. These analyses are going to be, for these we'll be looking at labor demand shocks at the MSA level. Okay. Then we're going to switch to the health and retirement study, and there we're looking from 1992 to 2008. We'll be bringing the 2010 data in soon, but to study the effect of labor demand shocks on individuals in panel. And there you can actually look at individual transitions in and out of the labor force. To get the labor demand changes, we're going to link that data using the geographic identifiers on the HRS to the quarterly census of employment and wages. And that analysis there, we're looking at commuting zones rather than MSAs. So this is essentially our first stage. So this is the relationship between the instrument and actual employment growth in MSAs. And so the instrument is on the x-axis, and the actual employment growth in the MSA, each dot is an MSA, is on the vertical axis. And the slope here is kind of interesting. We get for every 1 percentage point increase in the Bartik instrument, or in predicted employment growth, or predicted labor demand, we get a 2.4 percentage point increase in actual employment. Okay, so this suggests multiplier effects. You add jobs in an area, and related industries in that area grow as well. And in other analyses we've done, about roughly kind of maybe 2/3 of that multiplier effect is actually due to the services industry. The F-stat on the first stage is fairly strong, at about 31. So the first thing we're going to do is first look at how labor demand shocks are allocated across the age distribution. So do workers of all ages share in this predicted employment growth? Okay. So the first thing to see in this picture, that red line, that red horizontal line, is just showing that's at 1. Okay, so you can see that each one of these, what we essentially estimated, actual employment growth on instrumented Bartik growth. And then we're just plotting these age-specific coefficients here. And they're centered around 1. The red line there goes at 1, which means they're all positive. So it is true that all age groups benefit to some degree in employment growth in a local area. But they do so to differing degrees. And that's the first test we run, is just a simple test of a null hypothesis that all of these coefficients are equal. And we reject that hypothesis. They are not all equal. They do sort around 1. And we can actually also test a more specific hypothesis around, simply here, we're just showing a comparison of the points at 55. These are 5-year age intervals, so 55 to 59 and 60 to 64. And we do reject equality of those coefficients. And that would imply that there's heightened responsiveness at the upper end of this age distribution. And here we're just running from 25 to 70. So next, move from these 5-year age bins into 10-year age bins and try to decompose this effect into the part that's sort of driven by employment growth in service-related industries and non-service related industries. And so the first line just shows essentially what we were looking at before, but with these 10-year age bands. And so the first thing to point out is that in just simply estimating the effect of a 1-point increase in labor demand, we find that the upper age group, ages 65 to 74, is actually the most responsive. So a 1 percentage point increase in labor demand gives you 1.05, 1.06 percentage point increase in employment at ages 65 to 74. When we when we kind of decompose this into the services and the non-services industry components, we find virtually no effect of non-services industries and a huge effect coming from the service industry. So a 1 percentage point increase in employment that's due entirely to service industry growth translates into a 5.73 percentage point increase in employment in that upper age group, 65 to 74. So what's interesting about service industries? Well, they do seem to often feature jobs and occupations that tend to have some of the things that older workers often say they want. For example, this is just a simple comparison using the HRS data where we look at job requirements as reported by respondents for people working in the service industries versus other industries. Less physical effort, less heavy lifting, less stooping in the service industry positions. Not much of a difference in requirements for eyesight but we do see that they do require more concentration and skill in dealing with people. That's what PEOPLE stands for. We also looked at employer policies comparing service industries versus other industries. You don't have a lot to work with on this in the HRS, but there is a question about, are you able to reduce your hours if you want to? And we do see that in the service industry positions, people are more likely to be able to reduce their hours. This question about accommodate is whether your employer would accommodate an older worker's desire to move to a less demanding job for less pay. And there we see actually things going in the opposite direction, that other industries are actually more likely. Oh no, I had that. Did I get that right? Yeah, other industries are more likely. We looked at some psychosocial responses too, just for the interest of it, and slightly more work enjoyment in the service industries, but also some more stress. So that was just more of an aside. The other thing that's interesting about the service industries is the occupational composition, and the dominant sort of the occupations that really characterize services are professional specialty occupations. So these are fairly high-skilled occupations. We, for example, as economists are included in this category, but think science and technology, engineering, math, jobs, teachers, lawyers, social scientists, the health professions. The next group that kind of is characterized as being that's in the service industry would be the service occupations. And so these are the ones that are the lower skill occupations, such as I think cleaners, assistants, physician assistants, restaurant workers and the like. So the services industry really is sort of, I think, dominated by both these higher skilled occupations, but these lower skilled occupations are present as well. Okay, so it's sort of, as you're kind of thinking about how to relate, and this is part of what we've been doing, is thinking about how do you relate these industry shocks to the types of jobs that are emerging and that older workers might be flowing into. I think we've got both of these two groups at play here. So next, moving to the HRS, we wanted to look at the effect of these labor demand shocks on transitions in and out of the labor force. So the first, I'm just going to direct your attention to this first column here. You can kind of ignore the math about what we're doing here. It's just a simple simple probit model, and then calculating some marginal effects. So the interpretation here is that a 1 percentage point increase in labor demand would give you a 0.7 percentage point increase in the probability of continuing to work if you were already working. So that's just the probability of staying in the labor force. Okay, so labor demand shocks, positive labor demand shocks, are associated with people working longer. They're also associated with people re-entering the labor force if they've left. So that's the second column here, where a 1 percentage point increase in labor demand, and a 1 percentage point increase is roughly about a 1 standard deviation increase in labor demand, just for sense of magnitude. That gives you a 0.6 percentage point increase in the probability, or point increase in the probability of entering the workforce if you were not already in. We also see a reduction in the fraction of people and the probability of reporting that you're newly retired if you were not retired, and no statistical change in the probability of continuing to report that you're retired if you were already reporting retired. And this is just making use of, these latter two columns are just making use of the self-reported retirement information in the HRS. We also looked at Social Security claiming. So we do find that labor demand shocks, positive shocks, reduce claiming at the earliest age, at age 62. Marginally significant reduction at age 63, and also at age 64. Not so much at the older ages, but really this is what I thought was really most interesting here, is these are pretty big effects on a base of 40, so a 6.7 point reduction on a base of 46%. That's bigger than a 10% reduction in claiming associated with this 1 point labor demand shock. Moving next to pecuniary incentives. So here we were looking at log wages and labor earnings. So we do find that a 1 point increase in labor demand is associated with a 4% increase in wages among those who are incumbent already in the labor force, an 11% increase in wages among those who are entering in the labor force. So that's the second column here. We've kind of split these according to whether somebody was already in the workforce and continuing to stay versus out and re-entering in. And this is all HRS, and these are, these transitions. It's also associated with a $2,500 increase in labor earnings among those who are already in the labor force, and we're controlling for prior earnings. And then among those who are not in the labor force, a smaller increase, but still in percentage terms, not trivial. Finally, the non-pecuniary incentives. So of course, employers can offer increased wages to try to attract an older worker in to meet increased labor demand, or to keep an older worker in the labor force. But they can also offer different job conditions. And here we are beginning kind of a first exploration of how some of these non-pecuniary aspects of jobs might be responding to demand conditions. And I think the results are, this is obviously just kind of a start on this, but I think they're very intriguing. And you see that an increase in labor demand, this predicted employment growth in a local area, is associated with a reduction in physical effort required by the job, heavy lifting required by the job, stooping lifting by the job, no effects for eyesight or concentration. The two columns here, one are the incumbents, the stayers, and the other group is the entrants. So slight increase just on the margin of significance in people skills being required for the entrants. Just marginal significance here in the ability to reduce hours. So a labor demand shock perhaps does increase the number of people who now say they can reduce their hours on their jobs if they like. And we get some, kind of interesting but only marginally significant results on the psychosocial stuff. So To close, I think we're just getting started on this, but we're pretty intrigued by what we've seen so far. Local labor demand growth does seem to lead to increased employment by older workers, decreased retirement rates, increased wages and other non-pecuniary characteristics, and delays in Social Security claiming. The effects seem to be sizable enough to be worthy of, I think, future attention. The growth seems to be especially concentrated in the service industries, which I think are very interesting in that they're composed of these two groups, both the high-skilled and the low-skilled. So that's something we'd like to kind of dig in further to really figure out which part of the skill distribution is really benefiting from this increased growth. I think we already have some, we've started kind of unpacking these aggregate effects a little bit by looking at men versus women, or highly educated workers versus low educated workers. And the effects seem to be more strong for the women. So if I have to say that it looks like one group seems to be driving these results, it is the women. For the reentry results, it does seem to be driven by the higher educated workers. Okay, so that's a little bit trying to get at this underlying heterogeneity. And the thing that we think is quite interesting, and something we really hope to get more data on in order to explore better in the future, is that wages are not the only job characteristic that seems to be in play here, but also working conditions as well. So, thank you.
Great. The discussant is Joanna Lahey.
Thank you for this opportunity to discuss this great paper, the effect of local labor market demand conditions on the labor supply outcomes of older Americans. I'm just going to re-summarize everything that Nicole just said, even though she's a very clear presenter, so I don't really need to. But you have to fill 15 minutes somehow, right? They're looking at the effect of local labor market demand conditions on outcomes for older workers. They're using a Bartik index to instrument for local demand changes, which is a good standard instrument. They find that older workers, 55 to 64, 65 to 74, benefit from the higher labor demand. The numbers I pulled from the paper is it increases employment growth by 2.5, wages by 0.57. And this is similar to, possibly larger than, effects of this labor market demand on earlier ages. Then they do something neat, they get deeper. They ask, well, where are these workers going? What industries are they going into? And they find that the growth of the service sector drives results. And they argue that the service sector is more attractive to older workers. They also do something that's important. They look at welfare and policy effects. They find an effect on retirement behavior. 1 percentage point increase in employment growth increases continued work probability and increases the transition to work by about 0.6 to 0.7 percentage points. Reduces early Social Security claiming, which is kind of important for policymakers among 62 to 64-year-olds, finding that a 1 percentage point increase in the instrument kind of is tripled in the decrease in Social Security claiming. So. There's some things that I really like about this paper. They have some really good, really nice main findings. This is a literature that really hasn't been looked at in detail since around the 1980s for older workers. And of course, in the 1980s, they didn't have a Bartik index, and computers weren't as good, and so on. So even that literature, which you can mostly find in the Industrial Labor Relations Review, isn't as clean as this. Nicole also mentioned commuting zones. This is really cool. Instead of using an MSA as your basis of what a local labor market is, they actually have these commuting zones, which I think give a much better idea of what the local labor market for a worker actually is. Then they actually kind of get into the weeds. They're like, well, what industries are, how is this happening? What industry things are doing? And they're starting to look at heterogeneous effects by gender and education, which are very important, and they look at these important welfare and policy questions. Okay, so I have to admit that when I read the paper, I went to IPMS and I looked up, well, what is service? And I came up with, so I was like, well, this isn't what my idea of service jobs are. They're not retail jobs. Rick Hornbeck is a professor at Harvard, and he told me that his father had retired from like this, very draining job in the financial services industry, and he now does the cheese counter at Whole Foods. That's not what we're talking about here. So I thought that we were talking about things like nursing and cleaning and security and food prep and hairdressers, and I wasn't thinking about these more professional services things, because I think those are under professional on IPMS. And when you think about those kinds of jobs, you're thinking about the jobs that require those really thick white shoes, because they require a lot of standing and a lot of lifting. I really like the HRS job characteristics that she was showing, but it would be really nice if we could go a little bit deeper, as Nicole said that they're planning to do, to look at which service industries. Is this a healthcare story? Is this a self-employment story? Of people transitioning down? What actually is going on here? Another question that I had was, the averages, the regressions are showing averages of these HRS job characteristics, but could they actually be masking large drops as people transition from, say, manufacturing to service industry jobs, and maybe small increases, or what people in white-collar occupations are retiring, or they're getting a small increase in these kinds of characteristics. Another question that I had is, well, why is there this match between the older workers and the service industry? Is it that as labor demand increases, that these service industry jobs become more attractive? They have higher wages, and they're drawing people out of their career jobs, or they're drawing people out of retirement because these are all of a sudden these jobs are much more interesting? Or has there always been a pent-up demand for these kinds of jobs, but when there's a labor market demand shock, all of a sudden these firms are starting to become desperate, and so they're finally willing to hire older workers that they wouldn't have necessarily taken a chance on before? And so those are two kind of alternate explanations. Is it a push or is it a pull? And I think you might be able to look at the HRS, maybe look at the age composition of the service sector, kind of get more of a handle on that. Additionally, I think there's some other literatures that you can look at a little bit, interact with a little bit more. What do these jobs or firms look like? Are they less likely to be career jobs? Are they jobs that, for example, don't have pension, they don't have health insurance, and so they're more likely to be willing to take on these older workers, and these older workers who don't need the pensions, don't need the health insurance, it may be a better match. And there's already a small literature looking at firm size and showing that older workers are more likely, when they get a new job, they're more likely to go to these smaller firms that don't offer these benefits. And it might be interesting to see, are these service sector jobs also these smaller firms, and what's going on there. And since this is such a great paper, it caused me to ask a lot more questions, and there's a lot more areas of research. And I was thrilled to see Bob Willis's paper today, because I don't have to explain skill bias technical change. That was exactly one of the things that I was thinking about. How is this related to skill bias technical change? How are these service industry jobs going? There's service industry growth. What else is going on? Are there declines in other industries, and so on? Additionally, yesterday we talked a lot about, 70 is the new 60, or 72 is the new 65, or how have older people been changing over time? Another thought that I had here was at a Sloan conference that I went to many, many years ago at the Center for Aging and Work. we had someone from the hotel industry come in, and she said, how do we get these old cleaning ladies to retire, because we don't want to be horrible, horrible people and just kick them out because, you know, they're destitute and so on. And one of the comments that they got from a lot of people in the audience was, well, why don't you make it easier for them to do things like, you know, push the carts and change the bed sheets and so on. There's a lot of technical change that you can do, just like, you know, with the Disabilities Act and things like that. And she just was like, no, that's terrible. We'd like totally lose our advantage. Our hotel chain would go under and so on. However, as time has been going on, these things actually have been happening. They've been happening in the hotel industry. They've been happening in hospitals and so on. You have kind of a technological change. And, you know, some of this may be going on in these kinds of service industry things, at least the more physically demanding things that make it more older workers more able to have that kind of a match. Additionally, I'm really interested in seeing where these people are coming from. Are they, you know, what industries are they going from? What industries are they coming to? Are these manufacturing jobs that are dying out, and so these people are becoming cleaning ladies? Is it, you know, jobs that you know, have defined benefit pensions, and now they're like taking and now they're going back and you know, doing self-employment so that they can, you know, transition down and, you know, have some fun in their semi-retirement and so on. Another thing that I think would be really neat, they've done some pushing on gender differences, as we were talking about yesterday. Men and women over time have very different labor force experiences. And some work that I'm doing on health insurance, men and women have very different reactions to getting health insurance. And I think part of that may be because men always have these 0 to 40 career jobs, and it's much harder for them to transition to a brand new job that you know, has fewer hours, whereas a lot of women in these cohorts are very used to doing part-time. It's much easier for them to change their hours and so on. And so some of the things that we may be seeing with labor market demand is that women, it's actually easier for women to adjust, especially in these kinds of the lower skilled service occupations, or health, which is also female dominated, but not low skilled. Similarly, you can push more on differences by education. Again, when we're looking at health insurance, we see a lot of differences in how people react by education. When men get outside health insurance, the highly educated ones love to move into self-employment. The lower educated ones are more likely to retire. And you might see something like that with labor market demand as well. And also men and women separately by education, because they react differently by education. Another question that I had is, do positive and negative labor market shocks have different effects? It's very difficult to fire older workers, which makes people kind of reluctant to hire older workers. But, you know, if depending on the situation, you might see that older workers are less likely to be affected by a negative labor market shock. They might be more likely to be affected by a positive labor market shock. And some work has already been done on this in the paper, but I think it can be expanded a little bit more. Additionally, I'd like to see a back-of-the-envelope calculation on those Social Security results. You know, how do these numbers these results that they found affect welfare? How do they affect policy? You know, can we get some kind of magnitudes on that? And additionally, you know, put these numbers in perspective. How do these numbers compare to numbers for other kinds of shocks, other kinds of policy things, just sort of to get an idea of you know, what's going on and how important this is. So, in conclusion, this is a really great paper, and I hope that the authors will send me their next draft so that I can make more trenchant comments on it.
If I could start with one question, which is, Joanna mentioned it very briefly, but these people in the service industry, what fraction of them are self-employed, or what is self-employment a big part of the story, or not so much?
Yeah, we've just started looking at that, and what we did is we just took self-employment as an outcome and related the labor demand shocks to that, and actually self-employment declines. So 1 point increase in labor demand, self-employment goes down. So again, I think what's going to be interesting here is to unpack that result a little bit and get at the heterogeneity. Yeah. But that's what the aggregate kind of mean effect is. Yeah.
Other questions? Going once.
Just one short question. Thanks. The reduction of hours, any sense if that was voluntary or involuntary?
So that was simply, the question is simply, would your employer allow you to reduce your hours if you wanted to?
So the
it's
implication
completely
is
voluntary. It's really just, I think, a measure of flexibility in hours. Yeah.
Okay, thank you
All
very
right,
much.
thank you.